Now let's discuss as the in position preflop caller in a multi-way pot. Realize that due to your condensed preflop range, because you would have re-raised with your best hands from in position, you will rarely have much of a nut advantage against two or more players because your range lacks aces, kings, queens, and ace king, right? So there are going to be scenarios where when you do want to bet, you're going to be forced to use generally a pretty small size with a very linear range because you're going to be betting into multiple opponents. Also, you're going to find that your positional advantage is generally diminished just across the board against multiple players, and your equity realization is going to go down compared to multiple players because you're going to be getting raised by multiple different players compared to heads up pots. So you have to be very, very careful in these scenarios. Let's take a look at a few common spots. Low jack raises, we call on the button with the king queen. Big blind calls, flop comes king, jack 8, and they checked us. This is a hand that's almost always good but vulnerable, right? So we're going to be betting it. This is definitely a hand that can get value from worse hands. We are very happy betting and probably not folding this hand all that often. So this is a very clear hand that's going to bet. The question is, though, how much? You may naturally think you want to bet big on this dynamic board, but that is not going to be the case with these two players yet to act, especially if the low jack's going to be protecting their checking range by checking with some very good hands. So we're going to bet, but we're going to be betting small. So in this scenario, we go for something like a third pot. Let's take a look at this. So in this scenario, we are betting actually decently often, about 54% of the time, which is perhaps more than I would have thought. But the very logical hands to bet in this scenario are going to be the kings, right? Kings are just almost always good. Then we need to find some other hands that we're going to be betting, given we're betting more than that frequency. It looks like queens is betting some jacks are betting sometimes, like ace jack and queen jack. They're probably good whenever it goes check, check. If we bet and get raised, we can probably let those go. And then some draws. Draws are going to be queen 10, ace queen, ace 10. What about 10-9? Yeah, definitely 10-9. What about queen 9? Looks like a little bit of queen 9. And then it seems like we're also betting with some bottom pair type hands. This is going to be a common recurring pattern we're going to see in these scenarios. Bottom pair very often does go for a bet. Kind of odd in this scenario to see some just total airballs going for a bet, but they do. I guess that's the thing that in position does. But remember, we're betting kind of small. So when you are betting small, you do get away with going for smaller bet sizes in general. Just to be clear in this output, the red color, the color that's 30, half of the range. This is the small bet size. We do have some bigger bets, but they're negligible, right? So compared to the heads up spot where it was just button versus low jack, so if just this player raised, we called, flop comes, they check. Compared to that scenario, notice in that scenario we actually bet using a bigger size, because in that scenario, once they check the flop, their range starts to get very, very weak. And because of that, we are going to start to have a bit more of essentially a nut advantage against a relatively capped low jack range. But multi-way, low jack's going to be checking just more across the board, so they're naturally not going to be quite as capped, right? So when they're not quite as capped, we have to use smaller sizes. So heads up, we would be using something like 60% pot in this scenario. Multi-way, we're using smaller bets. When you use smaller bets, you usually get to bet a little bit more often. And also in multi-way pots, you need more protection, especially when you're in position. So this is a spot where we're going to be betting more often. Interesting to see that heads up, we only bet a third of the time, right? But we're betting generally polarized, something like good kings and better. Whereas multi-way, we're betting more often. Like take a look at hands like pocket queens, right? Pocket queens bets a lot of the time when we're playing multi-way because it's probably good but really vulnerable, whereas queens basically never bets heads up because it's way less vulnerable, right? That's kind of neat to see. What else? What are bottom pairs doing on king, jack, 8 over here? Notice the 8s bet basically never heads up, but they do bet sometimes multi-way. Because again, they don't mind protection. Also, they're going for smaller bets. When you bet smaller, you get to bet a little bit thinner just in general. Okay? Cool spot. So we bet. Big blind calls, low jack folds, turns a queen. Big blind checks. Now the board's very draw heavy. That said, there's a straight available. This is one of these spots where I actually don't know how big we're going to be betting. I got to presume we're going to be betting pretty big. We do go 60% pot. That's kind of big in a multi-way pot. Let's see what GTO does. So with king queen, it's not actually all that tricky because you just have a hand that's very likely good. Notice GTO either bets pot or 2/3 pot, so it does err towards a bigger size in this scenario. And I think it makes sense. You're going to find that in this scenario, some hands you may think you should bet as if we were in a heads up pot, like let's say king 9 or king 9. King 9 is a hand that may logically bet just straight up for value, or king 10. These hands don't get to bet quite as often. Take a look at the bluffs. Notice king 8 actually checks. That's kind of weird. I probably would have presumed that king 8 could bet, but notice it does not get to bet in this scenario all that often. It's kind of neat to see. So looks like the weaker kings just definitely don't get to bet in the spot. Take a look at what's bluffing, though. The bluffs in this scenario are going to come from hands containing an 8 some portion of the time. Notice we have 10-8 betting some portion of the time and 9-8 betting some portion of the time, which is a little bit weird. But at this point when we're betting, remember how I said in multi-way pots earlier that you want your bluffs to come from decently high equity hands, which is going to be hands like bottom pair. Because if you think about it, 10-8's almost never good here. 9-8's almost never good here. But it does have some equity, right? So we need to find these quote-unquote better bluffing hands. Of course, we're still going to be bluffing with various flush draws and whatnot. But it's a pretty cool scenario where we have to be a little bit very like value heavy in this scenario. What are we doing with stuff like a random 10? We don't really have any random 10s, do we? 10-9's a straight already. So we don't really have random 10s. What about random ace-x? Does random ace-x bet? It looks like it does sometimes. It looks like the weakest ones are going for the bet, which is kind of neat to see. That's something I would not have logically thought. But if you think about it, like what are our draws here? We really don't have a whole lot of draws given our range. Because, I mean, on king, queen, jack, 8. I mean, look, all of these hands are something, right? So all these hands are something. So find some bluffs. You got to look hard to find some bluffs. We have 9-7 for just a airball gut shot. We have flush draws down here. Then we have some underpairs. Notice the underpairs are going for bluffs. And that's kind of what I was thinking about logically. Anytime your range just really, really, really lines up with the board, you got to find some bluffs. And you don't want to be betting like top pair, no kickers. So, I mean, it's either going to be ace high or some underpairs. Cool spot. Kind of a weird scenario, but this is definitely a spot where you do want to keep betting with a lot of your best hands, even though we, of course, could be in bad shape against the straight. So we see a lot of the 2 pairs going for value in this scenario. Opponent calls. River's a 10, which is awful. Obviously, we're going to check it back here a ton. We're not going to be bluffing unless we have like an ace of clubs in our hand, I got to presume. Not obviously, we don't have a lot of those, but they will be with pairs some portion of the time. Then we'd be betting with flushes. So we got to be really, really cautious here. This is a spot where the opponent's range is going to be really, really, really good. All right, we lose. Fine. All right, ace 2 suited. Somebody raises in the low jack. We call on the button. Big blind calls. King 7-2. They check to us. All right. This is another spot I think we're going to be betting some. And remember how I discussed earlier, these bottom pair type hands usually go for some bets, especially if they're good a decent amount of the time and they don't really mind picking up the pot from in position. So I think we're going to go for a small bet. We do go for a small bet. Notice our small bet here is 25% pot. Okay? Let's take a look. Notice that GTO in this scenario uses a 15% pot bet or a 30% pot bet. That is tiny. Tiny, tiny, tiny. What is going for this tiny bet? Well, when we're betting tiny, we actually get to bet a decent amount of the time, right? And that's because we are betting with a decently wide range for thinnish value. Obviously, we're betting tiny with everything we're betting with. So that's going to be pairs, right? So notice the 2 bets, a lot of 7s bet, pairs, 7s, and higher bets a lot of the time. You do see some 6s and 5s, but it's negligible. And then we have just a smattering of backdoor draws. Again, on the king 7-2, it's kind of hard to find real draws, right? So we're going to be going with the logical backdoor draws for a small size. So we see like ace 3, ace 4, ace 5. A lot of hands with cards between a 7 and a king are going for a bet, right? Like 10-9 and 9-8. And then we have ace, queen, ace, jack, ace, 10 going for a bet sometimes. I mean, sure, I guess. Let's compare this to a heads up scenario where it's low jack against button. So imagine low jack raises, we call button, they check the flop. This is a spot where when they check, they're again usually going to be decently capped, so we just want to start putting money in the pot with our range because we're going to have a lot of kings in the spot. As you see, we have a lot of kings, and we have a lot of pairs that are in pretty good shape. So in this scenario, we are still betting little bit less often than in the multi-way pot. But again, the multi-way pot's using a tiny size, 15% pot compared to 30% pot. Okay. Also notice the heads up pot is not going for quite as much thin value with hands like king 5, king 4, I'm sorry, king 6 and king 5 suited. Also notice queens and jacks. They're doing a little bit more checking in the heads up pot because they need a little bit less protection, right? So in the multi-way pot, we're essentially just a little bit more linear, betting with, call them, let's say, marginal made hands that are usually very good. You can also see this in the nines and pocket nines, right? Notice pocket nines and pocket eights bets basically every time in the multi-way pot because it's probably good, but vulnerable, right? Whereas eights and sevens bets less often in the heads up pot. And when you bet with a hand like pocket eights for 15% pot, you may ask, like, what are we trying to do here? But we're trying to get the opponents to fold out overcards, right? If your opponent's sitting there with a hand like jack 10 and they fold out to a tiny bet, that's fine, right? Because they have 6 really clean outs against us, and by betting small, we get them to fold, and that's good. So actually a pretty decent amount of betting on this very uncoordinated board. And, we're going to get raised some portion of the time, and we just end up getting out of the way, right? It's not a big deal. So we go tiny. Both players call. You will find that once one player calls, the other players can call a decent amount of the time with all sorts of stuff, whether they should or whether they shouldn't. Turns to 8 of diamonds, and they check to us. What would I naturally do here? This is one of these spots where I think it's going to be pretty hard to find bluffs. So in this spot, when it's pretty hard to find bluffs, I mean, of course, we do have some straight draws, right? But do we even want to bet straight draws? We got to be careful betting straight draws because if we bet straight draws and get raised, it's nasty. I think we'd rather have some junkier bluffs that still have some equity. So I think that's going to be stuff like a 7 or a 2. And obviously, we don't have very many 2s, and we don't actually have all that many 7s. I think we probably do need to bluff this one, as funny as that sounds. Like I said, remember, again, like your bluffs in multi-way pots are usually going to come from your draws that are usually drawing pretty live, and this hand's drawing pretty live, and if we do get there, we're almost always good. So I don't mind this. I think this is probably a good play. I mean, let's see. Obviously, we're not going to be betting quite that often in this scenario because now for value, we don't get to go quite so wide. It looks like decent kings and better get to go for value a lot. Even then, sometimes they're checking. So notice in the scenario, we do see king 6 suited betting like half the time, king 8 suited betting most of the time. So it looks like kings can still go for value. I guess king 8's 2 pair, never mind. King 9 some portion of the time. So that makes sense. The nice thing about a hand containing a 2 or a 7 is that they block our opponents from having good hands like 2 pair. Remember, you always want to block your opponents from having auto calls, right? So in the spot, notice that like 9-7's betting a decent amount of the time. And ace-7's even betting a decent amount of the time, which I'm not sure I would have found an ace-7 bet. Notice 9-8 and 10-8 and jack-8 and queen-8. All these hands are betting a decent amount of the time too. And they're not betting because they think they're good. They're betting because these are going to be good bluffing hands on the turn and river because they're going to block the opponent's auto calls. Now again, these are all suited combinations. So this is like one combination of hands each. If you want to try to make this implementable, maybe just randomly pick the ace-2 and the 7-6 and the 9-8. And those are your bluffs. I think that's probably fine and reasonable. Notice that when we are betting the turn, we are betting are much more polarized, mainly a king or better for value, right? So when we're betting a king or better for value, now we are using mostly bigger bets, either pot or 2/3 pot. I'd probably just use 2/3 pot in general in this scenario. But again, I really want you to focus on what are we bluffing, because it's kind of easy to find the value hands, right? Just like good kings. Take good kings, bet good kings, life's easy. But you need to be able to find bluffs in this scenario, and you're going to find that a lot of the best bluffs in the spot have a pair. And I think most people don't bet nearly often enough in this spot with a pair. Again, you don't need to be betting this turn all that often, but when you do, you usually want to have some sort of pair to go with your hand. Notice hands like ace, queen, ace, jack are doing a lot of checking now. Queen jack's doing a lot of checking now, queen 10. Like all these random overcards that didn't really get much are checking. And also, you don't especially want to bet hands like 10-9, like I said, because notice if you do bet 10-9 and get raised, or jack 9 and get raised, you now have to fold out a hand that has very good equity, right? So we see these hands like gut shots and open-ended straight draws now not betting the turn, very importantly. Because if you look at our stack depth, if we bet 8 and they jam, we'd have to fold. Whereas here, if we bet 8 and they jam, we fold out, but we only had 5 outs. And we're not drawn to the nuts anyway. This is a much better hand to bet and then fold out to a shove. Let's see what they do. We get called by one player in the low jack. River's a 9. They check. Well, obviously we have 8-7. I just said we had 9-7 sometimes. We have 9-8 sometimes. So all that's good for us. Can kings go for value here? That's a good question. I think kings can probably go for value. I mean, this is another spot where you have to find some bluffs, right? Find some bluffs. So what are our bluffs? And we're starting to lose a lot of them because if you go back to what we did on the turn, this 9 actually lines up pretty well with our range to be bluffing. I think we're going to be betting this river decently often. And let's see what we do. It does look like we are ripping it in or checking. It does look like king-queen is the hand that can go for thin enough or thin value. If we were playing heads up, we'd probably be going for thinner value in this spot because I think a hand like king jack's pretty good. Notice we're not worried about the nuts for jack 10. So we don't really care about that. We don't really want to block jack 10. What we really want to block are sets and 2 pairs. So we really want to have, in this scenario, probably an 8 or a 7 if I had to guess. I think those would be pretty good bluffing cards. Like notice here, queen 8, jack 8 is bluffing a lot. Do we want to have a queen to block like king queen? Probably not. Notice the ace 2 is bluffing. Interesting to see the ace 4 and the ace 3 bluffing a lot. Even the ace 7 is ripping it in. I'm sorry, the ace 8 and ace 7 are ripping it in sometimes. That feels a little bit optimistic. This is another spot where I think if I was trying to be implementable in this spot, I'd probably just jam with the ace 2 for sure. Ace 4 and ace 3. Do we need to jam those? I mean, I guess they just randomly lose to like ace, queen, high, and stuff like that, so they can make those fold out. So I suppose that makes some sense. What are the 2 pairs that are most likely? Notice that from this player, they're not going to have a whole lot of 2s, so I'm not sure the 2 actually matters all that much. Maybe it does. I mean, clearly it matters some. The solver's ripping it in, right? So it does matter enough. Interesting spot, though. I think, I mean, a lot of people, when they get to this point, they probably do go too thin for value because I think in heads-up pots, you probably do go a little bit thin for value here with something like king-jack, maybe even king-10. If your opponent's gonna have a whole lot of, if they're gonna be really, really capped, but you can't be jamming quite so wide for value in multi-way pots because the opponent's gonna be way less capped in this spot. So cool to see. The ace 2 does just rip it in. We do rip it in. And you may say, when you shove here, like, are they ever folding a king? Probably not, but you have to realize they're gonna have hands weaker than a king. They're gonna have a lot of under pairs. They're gonna have a lot of 1 pairs. So you got to find some bluffs. Again, it feels dirty going for it in this spot. I fully get it. It feels really, really dirty going for the jam in this scenario because it's so easy to be against king 9 suited or something like that. But if a lot of players, especially if a lot of players bet those hands on the flop to begin with, they're going to be capped a lot of the time and they're just going to have to overfold. So this scenario where you are in position as the preflop caller, you got to remember, when you bet the flop, you're going to be betting the flop a little bit wider, and you're usually going to be using really, really small sizes than you may be used to because you really, really, really want protection. So you're essentially just going with a much more linear range of decent pairs and better and good draws and better. And then when you get to the turn, you're usually going to start polarizing your range as we did in that last hand. And on the river, you got to find some bluffs. You got to find some bluffs, even if they don't necessarily feel so good. If it was multi-way on the river, we would be bluffing less often because by the time we got to the river here, we were heads up. So would this 2 go for the bluff on the river? It probably would because that's going to block the big blind a lot from having sets in 2 pairs. So I think this ace 2, that's just a hand we're probably roped into going with it. And I don't think most people go for the jam there and they end up either just check folding and getting out of the pot, or they give up by the river and they end up just conceding the pot to the opponent. And obviously, those are not great results, and that would have worked out much more poorly this time, although sometimes, of course, your bluff's going to get caught. Sometimes your bluff's going to get caught, but if you're never bluffing, you become easy to play against.